Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's video is going to be about saturation. Now, saturation is something we hear all the time, or it's tape this, it's tube that, and what the hell is it? Now, I'm going to run through quite a lot of the thinking behind it, as is typical with me. If you're just looking for a 2-minute, use this plugin, it'll be great, mate. Not the guy for you. But if you stick with me, then you'll be better equipped to find what saturation devices are working for you, what saturation devices aren't really doing the job you want or hope them to be doing, and also to obviously avoid those that really aren't doing the saturation thing at all. So, number one, what is saturation? If we were to go out in the rain and come in soaking wet, we would be saturated. Doesn't help us a lot necessarily. It means that we'd become somewhat full of something else. What is it that we want to become full of in DAW speak to make everything better, cooler? Because saturation in this sense is related to distortion. Technically it is. Distortion by its technical essence is saying we put one thing in and we get another thing out. So saturation does that. But distortion is when we can hear it. So we'll go back to our simplest musical element, which is, of course, a sine wave. There we go. Not the world's most exciting thing. Just a sine wave. If we were to change that, it would mean that we are distorting that wave and turning it into something else. Now here what we've done is we've added some overtones. We can see one here, we can see one here, we can see one here. If I play that, it's not the same as this. Apart from the notes are different, the sound is different. If we were to be a little more subtle, so we've just got that wee bit of an overtone. There we go. If we're listening casually, we might say that's the same sound. Whereas here we've got an overtone, and maybe some we can't quite see. But here we've got none, so our sine wave, and then our overtoned sine wave. If you're listening carefully, and I do hope that you're watching this on proper speakers, I'm wearing headphones because I have to do this, but I'm not convinced headphones are the best way of doing it. I definitely don't hear the same in headphones as I hear through my trusted speakers. Up to you, but quality is of the essence here, otherwise you're going to hear nothing. And there are going to be great sections of this where you may go, but I'm not hearing any difference, Benedict. And that's a really important part of this, which we will discuss as we get into this. Some good and bad sides on both of that scenario. So, saturation is a kind of distortion. What does saturation seek to do? Now, this is a completely different thing. Distortion, if we were to look at the heavy side of distortion, then we can go, okay, we'll hit Dr. Distorto, and we'll turn it on here. We'll turn that back to a sine wave. So we've got our pure sine wave. The harder we drive it, the more we see it turn into a square wave. And we know that's a square wave because we can hear it's a square wave. But if we turn that off and we go till this says it's a square wave, we can hear a lot of the same characteristics. And if we look at what's happening here, we can actually tell they're kind of the same. So that's distortion, in that it's very, very obvious what's happening. We're really pushing things hard, and we're getting a different sound as a result. If that's what you're looking for, then let's not call that saturation. You may get by on a technicality, and that's okay, go for it, whatever amuses you, but I'm going to say let's not call that saturation. Saturation is really where we're not hearing a radical change, and yet things are different. Let's run through a situation here where we get a more complex sound. Every time I play a note there, it sounds the same. Yes, the pitch goes up and down. So what you see there on screen with the overtones, all our harmonics, yeah, they move around, but they're moving around perfectly. So the shape that we have here is really exactly the same as the shape we have here, which is exactly the same as the shape we have here. Now that we could say, wow, that's superb, that's a really great thing. Because you know what, if you're a guitarist and you play a low unfretted E, boing, and then you fret that, if you look closely, and you don't need to look closely, because if you listen half closely, as soon as you've fretted that, other than the fact that it's gone to a different note, a higher note, the tone has changed as well. Bloody guitars, pile of shit. Synthesizers, modern DAW-based synths, have nailed pretty well the whole idea of that and that and that are all perfect. Brilliant. The problem with that is that we then find it less enjoyable to listen to. There's not as much excitement in that. Yes, we can do things like filters that are moving around. But after a while, you know what? It's the same. We can tell it's really exactly the same as what I just said, only it's got the filtery stuff going on. We could do something like turning down the key follow, so it gets duller as we go up, brighter as we go down. It's nice. It'd be nicer if we had some delay on it. So why does it sound nicer with the delay on it? A couple of things, because we've given it a time dimension. But in giving it that time dimension, what have we done? It's the interaction of how the original signal and the delayed signal react with each other. So as we go, we've got the delay from this interacting with this. Adding a delay and doing that is relatively flat. Doing that, it's the interaction. That makes it sound more interesting and exciting for us. The process is no longer quite as perfect or linear. We've now made our process, our sound, what we're asking the consumer to listen to, less linear. It's become non-linear. But let's be real honest, it hasn't become non-linear enough to become too super exciting. Therefore, we try and do other things. We go back to our friend Dr. Distorto, and we start saying, okay, add some of you in. Now that's a bit too much. Obviously that's just getting... We hear a little bit more brilliance. In other words, there's a little bit more happening up here, just because we've added some harmonics. But if you look closely at what's happening here, and we'll use Scream to do this, you're going to see another problem. Let's use El Tubo. What are we really doing here? More than anything else, the biggest thing we're doing here is turning up the volume. Now, as humans, we are super sensitive to sound. Like really super sensitive to sound, far more than most of us give credit to. We're super sensitive to emotion, to voices, but to sound in general. And we make very fast emotive decisions upon sound. We cannot remember a volume of something. You can't actually say to me how many dB that sound was outputting at. You can't. You can, however, remember your emotional reaction to what was happening as this sound happened. That makes it very personal. Now this is improving that sound in certain ways. There's a little bit of bite, but that comes from two places. The two places that comes from is A, we've just turned up the volume. So by turning up the volume, we hear everything with more detail. The little parts of the sound have now become louder, so we can hear them better. Because we can hear them better, we feel like the sound is more detailed. It's more intimate, it's more exciting, it's got more little hooks into us. So number one thing, when you're looking at comparing sounds, especially when it comes to saturation or sound goodification, is to make sure your levels are the same. We can hear tone-wise they are not the same there. But if we push this a bit, we can not only see, but we can also hear that our levels are no longer the same. If I adjust my output level and use whatever you got to do, I can now A-B that. The reality is here with this process, even though tubes are commonly the first thing people reach for when they go, oh, I need some saturation in here, all we're doing is essentially EQing our sound in a certain way. Now, nothing against Scream, because I think Screams is a pretty cool distortion unit. And I've used it a lot and will continue to use a lot. But in terms of the real subtlety of saturation, Scream is not it. Even the tape setting is not it. It's nice enough, but really we're fooling ourselves by having a tone curve in there. So that's the equivalent of my simply setting up a tone curve. Now Scream's tone curves often tend to be more like this. Let's roll off a bit of bottom end with let's add some tops. And there is some reasonable logic to this. So it's not a case of saying Scream sucks, Propellerhead suck, Reason Studios suck. Not at all. Because when we work in the analog desk domain, you know what? They don't have the huge amounts of bass that DAWs have. Nor, interestingly, do they have the huge amounts of treble that DAWs have either. So the first thing that we might consider if we want to sound analog, and note that this is not the nature of this conversation, is probably to do that. Roll off some of the lows down here, because they just don't happen. And start to roll off some of this. It behaves differently. You can get into that if you want to mess around with analog, but analog, who gives a flying banana peel? because analog doesn't make things sound good. It merely makes them sound like they went through an analog process. That don't make a good record. The fact that a lot of great records were made in the analog era is not because it was an SSL or a Neve. It's not because of an Atari tape monster. None of that at all. It was all to do with mindsets. So back to where we're at. This is a distortion unit, and it does its job very well as that. Pulverizer in Reason, exactly the same. It's just a distortion unit. Now, most saturators are a kind of distortion unit as well. The next one that many of us have used, because there's nothing else in here that really fits, and I'm not going to get into audio whatever, because it's not my idea of a great thing. Oh, I'm in instruments, that's why. The Audiomatic is just not really my suggestion for. I think it's really a lot of processes which have been adapted out of Scream and the N-class compressors and all of that, and it's fine. It doesn't make it a bad device. If you're getting the sounds you want out of it, brilliant, go for it. But it's not what we're talking about here. The one that I would say that we should first start at within Reason is actually not a Reason device. It's the soft tube saturation knob. Let's go back to our sine wave, and we'll just flip this over and turn that off. Here's our device, it's doing nothing. Look, we're not really hearing anything. It's not like we're hearing that start to turn into a triangle wave or a square wave, but we're seeing stuff happen down here. And then once we get past a certain point, then it becomes distortion. And that's largely what the light on this tells us. It says, yeah, I'm not really a saturation knob anymore, I'm a distortion knob. But within this period here, we can see that we are adding overtones, even though in many ways that's the same as what a distortion unit's doing. This unit is designed to work. How it does it, I don't know, and nor do I entirely care, by adding little bits of overtone here. What this does is it means that our single sound sounds a little thicker because there's a little bit more happening around it. That's just like reverb or that delay that I added before. There's more happening around it. But if we're to play a line, with this on, automatically everything sounds that little bit better. Yes, some of this is because it does enhance the tops. It does do that. Not as much as Scream, but it does make things brighter. And that, to some extent, is the nature of saturation. But that allows us to add those extra little bits around. So that's our highs. See how we're adding a lot of... Interestingly, that happens after the fact. I must say it's not a thing I've noticed before. That's as the delay came in. That was going, okay, I've got a more complex signal. So we can emphasize our highs with this by putting all the drive energy that we've put into here into the high end, which will make a brighter sound, or we can keep it on the low. emphasis there. I mean, there we're in distortion so that we can see it. Now, it's subtle. In many ways, especially on an individual instrument, you won't hear it a lot. Because one of the really important things with saturation is that we probably shouldn't really be hearing it that much. By the time we're hearing it, we've got distortion. And that's okay if you're looking for a distorted sound. I mean, worked for Eddie Van Halen. But if we go distorting at our sound, then if we're looking for a clean sound or the sound that we're looking for, but we distort it, then quickly everything sounds distorted. And that's a massive problem with mixes over the last 20 years. It's very hard to listen to mixes that aren't full of distortion. And I don't mean cool distortion, I mean just ugliness. A very easy example to hear is stuff like Nine Inch Nails. You go listen to his Hurt, which I obviously always compare up against Johnny Cash's version of the same song. And Trent really misses the point of that song, but there's a lot of distortion on everything. And you might go, oh, but it's because it's in industrial Benedict and what's modern stuff's done. It's like the song is somewhat unfulfilling because the emphasis has gone on to all of that rather than the guts of it, which is what Cash gets to. Is just like, oh, with a voice that is very distorted, but it's naturally distorted. His voice is saturated, man. So this is a nice device within the Reason environment. This is a very nice device that you can get your sticky fingers on. You can get, if you're a VST person, you can get it as well. I think you have to sign up more for them than you do, at least when I got this. But it's a brilliant device. Does what it says it's going to do on the tin. Has a certain sound, but it does what it's going to do on the tin. So now let's go back to our slightly more complex signal. We'll keep the distortion off for now. Now again, we've got the problem of the saturation knob alone just makes everything louder. It would be nice if it came with a level up knob or level down knob, but as we add here, the volume goes up, which does make us feel like it's better. It's no different from if I were to say, okay, ooh, it sounds better. Yeah, of course it sounds better, but it is not better. It just sounds better. So this has some of that, but it's doing real things under the hood too. But here, once we've got that dialed in, that suddenly our sound becomes more alive. It's easy to think of a classic DAW synth sound as sounding kind of flat and sticky taped right to the center of your stereo field. So if you're looking at your computer screen with your speakers on either side, you can feel like it's just been sticky taped to that. I cut out the piece of paper and I sticky taped it to my computer screen, and that's where we start to feel like, oh, well, our stuff's not that cool. And a few records are ruined by the fact that people aren't listening to the notes, but more records are ruined by the fact that people feel like what they're doing is not cool. And that's a real problem. You've got to learn to step past that, because it doesn't matter how much saturation or distortion you use. If you're not paying attention to your notes, it'll still be shite. But as we bring in the saturation here, nothing to do with whether you like that sound or not, or my wonderful playing. It's about how that sound suddenly seems warmer, fuzzier, more vibrant, more alive, like it's coming forward. So if it was formerly flat and sticky taped to your monitor, it's now sort of out in front of that monitor a little bit sort of warm and round and fuzzy. The reason is because how that unit reacts is based upon what's happening with the signal more than it being the same. So that and that are no longer quite the same. And particularly as we do this, the way they interact causes that unit to actually behave differently. A distortion unit, a straight digital distortion unit, will behave exactly the same as the way that I spoke about before. We play our note and our series, our harmonic series is exactly the same here to here. A digital distortion will actually do exactly the same, bar getting into complexities over band limiting and or Nyquist frequencies and oversampling and stuff. We're not going to get into that at all. But once we start using a non-linear process, we've started to make these things not quite the same, but once they overlap each other in a performance, and especially if we've got that device is not doing this in a linear fashion, it's sort of doing this. And by that constantly moving around in a non-linear fashion, we suddenly have this constant sense of excitement around how this sound changes. Not just changing the notes. Yes, changing the notes should be exciting. That's music, because we hear the notes move around. It's like, ooh, it's telling a story. We know where it's going. It did something different. Saturation is a process of processes which do kind of what I just played. Rather than going back where we thought it was going to go, it did something different. And that makes us go, ooh, that's a bit interesting. We like that. Now, the next thing to know about saturation is that once we can hear it, it's distortion. We need to feel it. So keep it pretty low. And the more complex the material, the lower you need to keep it. Otherwise, we are getting into ripping distortion. And if you're looking for distortion, that's okay, but don't pretend you're playing the saturation game. But it compounds. So if we want to go back to the example of a studio in 1970, we plugged in our Roland, whatever it was, Jupiter 1 or whatever, in 1970. It used all of its hardware transformers and thinking inside its box, so it was already non-linear and just distorted, saturated right from there. That was before we tried to make some sort of, mofo wobble Reese paint stripping sound, just making a nice 1970 sound. It's saturated as it comes out of the back of that synth. We might well be plugging it into our analog delay unit, bucket brigade. That will add some distortion, but it will also add a lot of non-linear stuff. As it processes the signal, it actually messes it up. It munges it. That things don't behave the way they would if they were perfect. So that softens our signal up again. By softening, what we mean is, again, rather than being a linear process, it does this to the signal as it moves. If we play the same note over and over again, it's pretty scientific that that is going to deliver the same result over and over again. It's not like those capacitors and what have you were random. It was just that if you gave them a collection of things to do over, with varying levels, let's say we start quiet and we get loud, with a pure digital process, it'll do that perfectly. Whereas with a non-linear process, a capacitor or transformers or whatever, they'll they'll do this. They'll get to a point where they actually start to go downhill. And that means that it's a process more like this. Let's grab, where is it? This wee fella. I just found this. I think this is kind of cool. Let's keep it open. Now we have a linear process right now. I have to turn this off every time. The analyzer holding its curve actually annoys me. I appreciate its usefulness, but it annoys me. But we see our process here, it's linear. And it'll do. So our EQ curve is the same whether we're playing that one or that one. Linear process. Nothing's happened. If, however, we do this and this, hear how that sound, because you gotta love my prog rock playing, you hear how that sound suddenly sounds more exciting. Okay, we'll level match. When that's in, even though it's reasonably level matched, it sounds better. And you can say, yeah, because you put more treble on it. Yeah, and that's true. But we've made a non-linear process. What if we pick somewhere in the middle? You can hear that, how that's affecting that. Again, non-linear process. Because as the sound travels up and down, it meets this, rather than meeting this, it meets this. Therefore, it becomes exciting to our ears because it's different. If we put that before our saturation knob, our sound is becoming more alive because we're giving it difference over the range in which it behaves. There would be no point if there was no frequency down here. There's no point in having an EQ thing here. But we can put one there. If they're too So a lot of saturation devices, what they'll do is just give you a boost at about 6K. And you feel like, oh, that's so much better. Yeah, okay, it is enhancing those overtones if they're there, but if they're not there, it's not created them. So that's what a non-linear process could look like, because it is one. But our saturation knob is more complex than that, all depending upon how complex the process is. I think the process inside saturation knob is relatively simple. Nothing against Softtube, because I think they've provided a really nice device that I've gotten a lot of value out of. But as you see here, if we add a more complex non-linear process, which is some EQ and some official saturation, super mild distortion, modification of the signal shape, then we end up with extra layers of interesting. And that largely is what saturation is. No, it's not EQ, but it's about compounding a few layers of nonlinear. If we take it suddenly sounds better with that distortion unit in, but it's not the world's greatest saturation device. If we add back that soft tube, apart from it's got louder, it's become a little bit better. Now let's look at a few other devices that you may well encounter. I'm not showing you everything, but some of the things that I have encountered. Some of them are built into compressors. Compression is a non-linear process if you're using something that's not, say, like an M-class type thing. And again, nothing against the M-class. I actually quite like it. I think it's a pretty good don't hear that I'm compressing compressor. But if you want to hear that you're compressing, then this is a hear I'm compressing. She will get rid of that delay because delay does mess up compression. It's not to say you shouldn't do it. I do it all the time, but you're changing what you're compressing. Now this device, its default setting is enthusiastic, as is common. There it is. Now this has a kind of saturation. It's also probably a kind of distortion, but we can turn the level up, but attached to this, you can hear it start to drive, and that's based on the output of this. So it should be possible to take this and drive it. That's similar to the dirt in Pulverizer. So we don't actually need the compression at all. But that's a nice tool for adding a little bit of character. It has changed the nature of the beast, so to speak. Now we can see here that our levels have changed, but to get the saturation, it's a combination of how much drive we're putting on and what our output levels are here. So it's this one I worked out to be about 15, whilst you've got about 50% drive. If you listen carefully, you can hear that happening. Again, that's a pretty distortion-based saturation. It works quite nicely in a mix. For a free device, I think it's really rather good. Air Raid, it is a distortion device. Again, it's a hard clipper. We get into some other nasty sort of sounding distortions. That one, we'll give ourselves a delay back. That's not too bad. But again, you kind of get this flat feeling from it. eWindows, I just downloaded these. I don't know what if anything that I would recommend in there, stuff that I've built in Synthedit, I got to say, there's something in the Synthedit thing that does add a signal changingness. I'm not going to go into those and sell those to you. G-Clip, not sold on. That one's not going to last. This one does. It's playing with some distortion side saturation and possibly some EQ curve. And it does that regardless of the of our thresholds and compression. Obviously it gets super loud. Now, I effectively never use that on an instrument. I use that on my masters. It's the end of the line for me, but it does say that that's what it does, and I think it does do that. The Joa Chip Mars distortion I've used, and you've probably seen it in some of my things, is really a distortion unit. You can go light on. Kilohertz, I don't really feel like I have anything for them that does that. That's just an EQ. Classic filter sort of does, but it's there as a filter, so you're getting into other things. Now the saturator, Melder's saturator, this says this is what this does. Now we do want to set auto gain, because otherwise it's just getting louder. Again, it's really, really subtle. So over YouTube, you may even struggle to hear it as well on a single instrument. But what we get is a sense of this instrument isn't so perfectly defined. It starts to swell, starts to become furry. Until it really does distort. That is not a bad saturator. It's not my favorite, because again, there's a lot of emphasis on basically the distortion side of it. Everybody's grabbed onto, you can create saturation with tiny amounts of distortion, add a few harmonics, and it's saturation. One of the problems is that they're not non-linear enough. So in other words, they're doing the same stuff everywhere. So yes, they initially sound better, but then after a little while you're like, yeah, but it kind of sounds as flat as it did before. Nick Crow, now this was one of the really early big names in this kind of biz. Tube driver. He tells you here how much total harmonic distortion's being added. So we can change our bias so we're getting more of it. But we hear very quickly it's turning into more of a distortion unit than anything else. We can change our EQs. That's how we do it. But again, as a saturator, this is really behaving as a distortion unit. And that's okay. But we're more changing the tone of our sound than the feel of our sound. And you might go, oh, but everything's tone, Benedict. No, with saturation, no, not so much. It's more about feel. You're looking for that sense that that instrument that feels stuck flat to your screen has now become, as it moves around, rather than being we all move the same, it's furry. I'm not going to say this is a bad plugin at all. Really all we've done is mess with our tone and create some distortion. Now the sound probably is nice, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not creating that sense. It's still that sound, it's just changed its frequency components a little bit. And that's cool, but it's not really giving us anything else. We've got a similar thing with this fella. It's a freebie. This one we really have to watch our levels on. It's built on an old Abbey Road, or pair of Abbey Road desks, so sort of Beatles type desks that we used. Tie it into. So you see we've really got to control our levels. We can make it squeal. Very similar process, but it does feel a little different. Now, each one of these devices is going to feel different. The melder feels quite sort of warm and furry. It creates a lot of fuzz in the middle of things. This is very bright and toppy. And there are other emulations of this. Waves have emulations of this which don't seem as bright and toppy as this. But this is bright and toppy, and I like it because of that, because if I'm looking for a brighter, toppier sort of a sound, you know, a DX7 type thing, then this is a nice way to help enhance that brightness and toppiness of it. Obviously we can get into EQ as well. Our different modes define where the different EQs behave and everything. It will start to rip into distortion quite easily. But around the centre of where it's supposed to be, but its emphasis is very much on toppiness. You can add low end to things, which has got a big bottom end boost. You can hear again how it's pushing up the levels and it's going into distortion. But with care in the right situation, that's actually quite a nice device. You've got to get your head around how it's going to work for you, and it might not work for you at all. If you're after sort of warm and fuzzy, the melder is a good way to go, so long as you don't overdo it. The soft tube is a wonderful all-rounder. You really can't go wrong with that little fella. These guys, there's stuff built in on these. The C1L1 I've had for ages. You don't really hear it, although you do a bit more on this guy. It's just a preset. Not a bad device at all. I've just got that one on trial. I don't think I'm going to buy it because I've got the C1L1. But it is a cool thing, and I probably would use it as a very quick and easy compressor if I were looking for such a thing. Selig's Color EQ I don't own. I kind of wish I did, but I don't. We've done that one. Softphonics has a few things in this arena, but we'll look mostly at Fat 50, Fatso. We'll make sure that the lo-fi is off, because that's bit crushing and saturation are massively not the same thing. Mojo moves things around somehow. What it does, don't know. Could ask the guy, because I do a lot of work with him, but no reason why Nick needs to tell me, no reason why I need to tell anyone else. And we've just added a lot of level there, so we can hear a little tonal difference. It's a little bit more nasal appearing in there. That one's not turned in. But Mojo's kind of cool. It is non-linear. It does move things around a little bit. Warming, which is this one. We can hear it's adding a lot of wood. So it's kind of adding a lot here. So it warms by adding this bulk into our mids, and therefore taking some of the emphasis off the treble. Whether it turns down treble, I don't know, but it doesn't need to because it's adding. But it's really once we get into the distortion that we'll turn these off. The transistor, which easily distorts. So that's like what I showed you before with an EQ curve, either before or after the soft tube saturator knob. By combining a couple of processes, we can make everything seem to come alive just that little bit more. But you know what? There's something else we can do there too. Take the old random. We don't want to overdo it. 3 might be the way to go. That has added a little bit more. And again, bear in mind, I can barely hear it in these things. I can hear what's going on and I can hear a lot of detail, but spatial stuff, that subtle stuff does not translate in cans, is my opinion. Maybe if you've got $1 trillion cans, it does or whatever. But the kind of stuff I'm talking about, I'm not sure that it ever does or ever can, because ears are about air, and this is not about direct injection. So Fatso is not a bad way to go if you're looking for something inside reason with a little bit more than one dimension. He's got this fella too, which is the Baxendall, so it's a sweetening EQ. And that has his mojo and warming built in. Again, easy to think, that doesn't do a lot, but it actually does. Let's make this a little bit brighter. We've had enough of this sound. Less of that, More of that, some of this. Getting popular all of a sudden. We'll turn our distortion off there. So there's a straight signal. And strings can very easily sound quite dead. Especially if you're not working them hard. So that's got whatever's happening with the mojo, and I think a little bit of saturation, a little bit of drive in there, as well as what you've done with the EQ curve. So subtle, but a few of those will build up over time. That's quite a nice doohickey. Soft tube we've done. That music company, they're just straight into distortions. It's a shame because I kind of like his distortion models, but it's all like 100% or nothing with them, which is a real shame. Then we got this fella. This is a real popular one out there because it's free and it's actually super work. You turn on your saturation. Let's make the most of it. These models, apart from being silly names, they're actually based on things. You know, do your reading on those. They're not just more. There is logic behind them. So we add in the EQ. This has a reasonable auto gain feature, so fairly well accurate, as long as that's in. Hear how that lifts. It suddenly gets a little bit more in it as we go. This is lovely adding. So even a sound that's not doing a lot down there will gain this feeling of body, of weight from doing that. It's an EQ. Different models. And if you buy the gentleman's edition, you get some more models and extra stuff and what have you. But in terms of just as a saturation unit, and saturation in this works most or best, or you get more of it when you're got gains on your EQ. If you're cutting but not boosting, then you don't have as much in the way of. So it's not really a straight saturation unit, it's an EQ that has saturation built into the EQs. It is a nice unit, and I do use that a bit, especially where I want the two things to go together. It's a lighter, silkier sound, so your melder, again, is that big, fat, furry kind of sound, which works well on some things. Obviously, their thinking is much more EDM, so it's basses and this, that, and the other. But for more subtle sounds, area sorts of sounds, so the strings like that, real synth sounds that aren't meant to sound the Tokyo Dawn Slick is very nice for that, as is the Soft Tube knob. They're really good for that. And that's really all, except for this one, which is a demo. I've just started playing with it yesterday. What I'll hear in headphones, I don't know. Big ass GUI, which you can turn green. True Wine, Kazrog. This has been out for a little while and generally has gotten really great feedback everywhere it's gone. I've been funny about going too far down this road, but playing with this yesterday for some time, and I must say I really did like it. So I'm not going to get any kickbacks if you go and buy it, but listen to it. But hopefully after you've listened to this and started to understand, because if you don't understand it, you'll drive it too hard and then you won't be doing what it's meant to do. What it says is that it's got these various transformer models. How it's doing them, I don't know. It might be through fast Fouriers or imprints or something like that. Don't know. But you can apply these different characters. This one is sort of your classic mastering one because it creates more overtones. And so therefore it's got a brighter sheen to it. But there's more going on in here than just saying let's add some distortion. Because even if we take this into aggressive territory, see how we're adding 24, 27 dB and everything's sort of maxed out. And it's not until then that we start to get distortion. So if you're thinking that oh, well, saturation's all just distortion, you initially go, this plugin does nothing. No, it does a lot. With small amounts of work. Now we've added level there. That's just its thing to remind me that I probably should buy it. Still a little loud. They tell me that bypass is supposed to be like sort of seamless. Doesn't work, at least not in Reason. Now you'll notice that a single note doesn't necessarily sound that much different. This is providing some tone control, whatever it's doing underneath, but it's in the overall performance that we notice the difference. And that's nice, but it's very predictable. But when this is on, it really feels different. Through the performance, we feel like we're getting different styling. Not every model suits every situation. So you've got to sort of pick and choose and work out which is which. And if you move fast, it all sounds the same and you think nothing's happening. But it's not I don't believe it's a snake oil thing at all. Matter of fact, Mr. Snake Oil was sort of all over this as where I encountered it. What I feel like I hear, and even to some extent in headphones, is that rather than, as I said, this feeling of it, the sound being cut out, piece of paper, sticky taped to my computer screen, that it's now moving like this, and that the sounds really kind of create a dimensionality to themselves. So far, really liking that. Now, I did play with some Waves stuff, and I was almost ready to pull the trigger on some Waves things. I won't say what they were publicly because it may not be fair, especially seeing one of them was a signature unit. And I like the guy's work. And it did sound nice. It added weight. It did everything it said it was going to do. But once I took one of my pieces, one of my recent pieces, something unreleased, I think I would have that come out on my birthday on Thursday. It clagged my machine. So my machine just said, no, not going to happen. Now, this is an i7, so it shouldn't necessarily happen. I felt like, yeah, it was kind of, once I'd used it quite a bit, it was kind of samey, and the fact that it clagged my machine said this is not going to happen. So we've got one layer here. What we would then do, and this is where saturation really, really comes alive, I would have my slick EQ. Adding a little bit of brightness, add a little bit of bottom end because, well, there's nothing happening down there. Some drive there. So the voice balance is a bit better. Obviously that's adding some EQ. Excuse us whilst it sleeps. And the EQ is becoming a little dominant over what True Iron's doing. But let's go all the way. Pop this guy in. We'll use a different model. We don't want to be driving too hard. That'll do. We'll go with him. Even with the one note, I feel like there's a little bit of jump out. Hopefully that's not Kazrog being sneaky and adding a dB or half a dB that we can't really see on our meters, but it does feel like. And a lot of people who really know what they're doing and really know what they're talking about have liked this unit and been very positive about it. It got a really good rap in Tape-Op magazine. And generally, or at least traditionally, I haven't read Tape-Op for ages, but traditionally Tape-Op was not exactly gear sluts. So we'd have that. Now we would commonly, if we were doing our mastering, have a bit of the old compressionation. Now I very much like this Master Brush compressor, which also very, very sneakily adds a whole pile of dB. Naughty, naughty. Let's put that back to 0. Obviously we'll have to go hard because there we go. So that creates a little bit of non-linearity because obviously it behaves differently based on the performance. I would traditionally add some EQ. Let's just add a straight EQ. Not that one. Let's go with the M class because you don't get much straighter than that. Add a couple of dB there. Chop that off. Let's assume that it's going to be a bit thick in the 400 because it probably is. Just give it a little bit of breathing room there. Now that has made it sound sweeter. Then we'd pop in this fella. Now when I master, I rarely do more than 0.7. Tempting to go, but we're starting to rely more on distortion than anything else, and it becomes obviously a big level thing. Now, forgive me, this is going to get loud. Actually, we'll just turn this off, so this will get loud. Now we've got a lot more happening in the top end. It's a lot brighter. Brighter as clarity as leap at. That's good. A lot of times when we master things, myself included, I'll be honest, we tend to go too heavy on the low end, and forget that leap out, that be shiny, be really engaging is in the top end. So we've added a bit of top end in a couple of places here. So if we got rid of pure EQs, to me, it's far more, particularly with this true iron, it's far more in the feeling of how between those notes, suddenly rather than all the sounds being flat and perfect, they kind of, I was going to say comb filtered, but they're absolutely not comb filters at all. But that sense that things move in and out, and therefore you get a more 3D feeling to the sounds. Without them there. So if we turn off that and that. Now, if anything, I would actually say that what sounds better here is probably without these EQs, or at least without the second one. They suggest, Kazrog suggests to put it at the beginning of all your processes because that way you start with a tubey thing. Don't know, like anything in reason, I'd like to drag them around and see where they feel best. Traditionally, in mastering, you would compress, put back your whatever you've lost in your compression with your EQ. That guy because we know it's a bit flat, which is why I chose it initially. Again, there's just this feeling that yes, there's some EQ change, but that the sounds move and change and they feel silkier and they feel deeper. Saturation knob has them feel brighter and more detailed, but true iron has them feel deeper. So if I put in my usual IOX, the Onyx, I'll leave stereo link on, into sample limiting, make sure that we're down at, because we never want to go to 0. It's okay here, but, and we'll get the maximizer out of the way. Again, that's more of a tonal thing. It's changing the tone. And it's nice. It adds brightness and clarity. and possibly rolls off some bottom end as a result of it, or at least rebalances that. But what True Iron's doing, and this is where we come back to where I was sort of saying, true saturation really is a little different. And what this is doing, harder for me to say, but in some situations it doesn't work. In some situations there's either nothing, or it's like, oh, that didn't sound so good. So, saturation, you may get to the end of this and go, but you haven't given me a definitive, simple thing to go out and do and get this object and put the knob there and I'll be good. No. Saturation is... It's not a case of just going out and buying the Waves J305 or whatever it is tape unit and going, yeah, I'm good, or the Fab Filter Pro Saturn. It's not as simple as that. What we're really looking for is that ability to create that feeling of movement in 3D, which is beyond just making things brighter. That's distortion, or EQing and distortion. What we look for is that way to make that mix seem more 3D. And it's not like I'm saying you can only do it with something like True Iron or even any particular device, but finding ways to make the way your devices interact, and that includes with reverb. Let's put a little bit of reverb in here. The way they interact once you put in some reverb is going to be different, and that is going to be... That's going to be how things start to move around a lot more. But from yesterday and today, looking at it again here, I do feel like in the right situations, something that is outside of the realm of being a straight minor overdrive unit is probably going to give you far better sense of depth and reality in an instrument than simply adding more distorted overtones and brilliance overtones. This does some of that, as for sure. There's some of these models in here definitely do that more than others. The 111C definitely adds a little bit more brilliance than some of the others. But it's the movement aspect that very subtle, but once we've got a few layers of that, once we have a real mix, and playing around to me never comes out the same as actually putting it into battle. Once we've got a few layers of different things doing different things, if you just simply attach the same thing to everything, like let's say we took every sound, put saturation knob on at this, and then did the same thing in our master, all we're doing is compounding that. And that's good. That's a positive thing about saturation. But if we're compounding the same thing over and over, it's probably not really giving us the variety of sound, the variety of feel, the variety of tone, the variety of behavior within those tones, because that's what saturation to me is about devices behaving differently in that non-linear fashion. You're not going to get that if you put the same process slavishly on everything as they got in 1970 when they plugged in their Jupiter 1 and waited for Rod Stewart to turn up, because all their different devices all had different characteristics, whereas our DAWs tend to have the same characteristics. And while it's tempting to say, oh, but I'll just pull in a grab bag of different things from different manufacturers, most of those manufacturers are doing exactly the same thing, especially on the free end of town. And that's great, these things are free. But they're tending to do the easy formulaic thing. It's only once you get outside of that you start to hear things that are like, oh, that really sounds and feels different. It's the feels different because rather than being the obvious simple linear process or the cliched, yes, we'll just do that instead, which is still essentially a linear process because it's the same thing everybody else is doing. The manufacturers that work out how to do this are the ones that are really going to give you things that feel different. There have been a few devices over the years that I've been impressed by. There have been a few devices where I've sort of scratched my head and gone, I don't know how they do it, but it's like this. True Iron's one of them. That does feel like it moves things around, and when you get it right, which is not all the time, but when you get it right, you suddenly feel a bit more like you've got a 70s or an 80s thing in front of you, which is nice. The other one was a Magic Death Eye compressor. Stupid name. But that one has some kind of magic going on in there, that the way it behaves is outside of the way that these things normally behave. But at $150, it's not the easiest thing to be getting your hands on easily. I mean, it's easy to go out and just buy lots of everything, but I have to be very cautious with my investments. But I'm thinking that maybe True Iron is worth investing in, because most of the other things that I've shown you here that I've compared it up against, including the Waves thing, were rather one-dimensional. So it was like saying, rather than doing this, we'll do this, and because it's a bit different from this, you'll go, oh wow, that's cool. Yeah, but that's fine. I could release a device with a knob on it that just basically had a preset EQ curve in it that you couldn't see. As you turn up the knob, it increases that EQ curve, and a lot of people would say that that was a really cool effect. I guess it is. It's changing your sound, but it's not doing anything. It's not really getting in there and rearranging things as it goes. If I created a device that had a knob, and inside it had a constantly evolving EQ process, so it was constantly undulating, that's one where you might say, that's a little hard to work out what it's doing, but when you put it on things, they really feel like they move around that's saturation. That to me is the essence of that magic ingredient where a sound does more than just start to distort. It starts to really move out into a third dimension as such. Sometimes it feels like that, but so it doesn't always sound the same no matter what it's doing. I hope this is helpful. I really do. It takes some time to get your head around this because it's subtle. Start with the simple, obvious freebies like that. Start to get your head around them. Then once you feel like, yeah, I'm learning to be more subtle in what I hear, then try some of the other things. But don't rush into a lot of stuff, because as I said, a lot of stuff is really just doing more of the same. And you've got that already in the core units inside your DAW. Have a good day. If you've got any questions, ask them.